Testing.
Let me welcome you to this Wallace Stegner Center Green Bag event, one of several during this spring semester 2016 here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. I'm Bob Kiter, director of the Wallace Stegner Center, and we're very pleased to present these Green Bag presentations on timely topics. Today's is particularly timely. Before we get to it, let me, first of all, welcome you. Let me welcome our remote audience. We are being video streamed live. And let me also note that today, believe it or not, is not Tuesday, but it's Monday here at the College of Law. And as a result, we have a Monday class schedule. So some of the students in the room, I understand, will have to leave right before 1 o'clock in order to catch a class. They'll exit quietly, but we will continue until quarter after or so, assuming there are questions. Let me also note a couple of upcoming Stegner Center events. Most prominently, March 31st and April 1st, the 21st Annual Stegner Center Symposium on Green Infrastructure, Resilient Cities, New Challenges, New Solutions. That will be preceded the day before, March 30th, over the noon hour, by the annual Wallace Stegner Lecture by Professor Larry Susskind from MIT. And then also, let me note, before then, on the 1st of March, we will have our next Green Bag presentation. That will be by David Nimkin, who's a Senior Managing Director for the Southwest region of the National Parks Conservation Association. And he will be speaking on the topic of America's National Parks Centennial. Are the parks in peril? A timely topic given that 2016 is the centennial year for our national park system and the National Park Service. Now, let me introduce Dr. Kerry Kelly, who is an assistant professor in chemical engineering here at the University of Utah. She also serves as vice chair of the State of Utah Air Quality Board. Her research focuses on air quality, carbon management, and evaluating emerging energy technologies. And she is joined by Dr. Robert Paine III, who is a pulmonary and critical care medicine physician here at the University of Utah. He's board certified in internal medicine, pulmonary medicine, and critical care medicine, and his research program is related to the causes and treatments of acute lung injury. They are speaking on, as I noted, a very timely topic today, one that's of concern, I think, to everyone that lives in the Wasatch Front area, and that is air quality. They will be addressing why Utah struggles with air quality and how this affects human health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kerry Kelly and Dr. Robert Paine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So thanks so much for inviting us, and we're going to try to wrap it up before the students leave in case you wanted to ask questions, because that's the most fun anyway. And then I also wanted to thank you for inviting me. I've had a chance to come to many of your Green Bag seminars, and they're great, and so I'm really thankful to be able to participate. So we're going to talk about particles and people, and a little bit about where particles come from and their health effects. So, and this is, as Bob mentioned, this is going to be a little bit of a tag team. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why, just high level, why do we care about particulate matter? Where does it come from here in Utah? And then Rob's going to talk about how this affects health, and then what is clinically important with respect to particulate matter. Also, why do we need additional studies of health and particulate matter? And then what are we and what can you do about it? So to start out at a really high global level, so this shows the NASA image of annual ambient levels of fine particulate matter. It's estimated from satellite data, and you can see some hot spots throughout the world. You can see areas like northern China, India, North Africa, very high ambient levels of particulate matter. But you can see Utah you can't even really see, you can start to see the Salt Lake, but you can barely see that the color has changed a little bit there. And that illustrates that our problem isn't so much with ambient average levels of particulate matter, but it's more episodic in nature. So why is it important? It's important for our health, and one of the sort of key metrics of health is death. So the World Health Organization estimates that 3.7 million people died as a result of ambient pollution in 2012. And in addition, about 4.3 million people died from indoor air pollution. And among pollutants, fine particulate matter really drives all these effects. So it's responsible for the majority of these deaths and adverse health effects. So it's something that people are very concerned about. So I did just want to mention that large number of people who are affected by indoor pollution. That is primarily caused by indoor solid fuel combustion for heating and cooking. And this is a huge problem because about 3 billion people worldwide heat their homes and cook with solid fuel. So although we're focused more with ambient levels, I just wanted to place that a little bit in a global context. So worldwide, some of the main causes of poor air quality are transportation, wildfires and agricultural burning, power generation, solid fuel burning both indoors and outdoors, and waste management. And in addition, just like here, meteorology and topology can have a big influence on how that pollution interacts and whether or not it sticks around for a while. So Utah's air quality challenges. So if we think about some of the criteria pollutants and hazardous air pollutants, our problems are associated with fine particulate matter during the winter, and we're currently classified as non-attainment for fine particulate matter. It's anticipated that we are going to be classified as a serious non-attainment area by EPA in the near future. And currently, we do meet the ozone standards, but EPA recently lowered their ozone standards to 70 ppb, and we anticipate that the Wasatch Front is going to have quite a bit of trouble meeting that standard. In addition, the Uinta Basin is likely going to have troubles meeting the ozone standard, and their problem with ozone is in the wintertime, whereas our problem is in the summertime with ozone. For the other criteria pollutants, in general, the Wasatch Front does not have so much trouble meeting them. I should just mention air toxics, and the Division of Air Quality has a study they're doing right now to look at air toxics out in West Valley to see what some of the most important air toxics are for that area. So a little bit more about particulate matter. So particulate matter, from a regulatory standpoint, is classified in two categories. One is PM10, that's respirable. That means you can inhale it. And that's about 1/10 of the size of a human hair. Then there's fine particulate matter, which is about 1/20th the size of a human hair, and that can deposit deeply into your lungs. And the other thing to know about particulate matter is it's kind of a complex mixture of solid material that's emitted directly from its sources, nitrates and sulfates and metals, and this changes dynamically in the atmosphere. So it is a little bit of a difficult beast to characterize exactly what this is. So some of you may have noticed, especially last week, that we do periodically have very high levels of particulate matter. And based on this, the American Lung Association has given us an F in terms of air quality and lung health, and for our wintertime short-term levels of particulate matter. In addition, they also give us an F for ozone because of our summertime ozone levels. This is an example of a headline we saw last week. Pollution levels worse than ever, hospital patients, sort of hospital visits spike. So again, you're pretty aware of this if you live here in this valley or if you were here last week. So this is kind of what levels look like in a somewhat typical winter. So this is the winter of 2013, 2014. You'll see ambient levels of particulate matter, and what happens is you'll get a weather event. You'll perhaps get precipitation on the ground, snow maybe, and then you'll get a high pressure system that moves in on top of that, and that acts like a lid. And so then what happens is all the pollution that we emit into our valley stays in this lidded bowl that is now our valley. And so pollution levels increase until we get a weather event to wash that out. And you can see this very cyclical pattern of particulate matter. And then you'll see that around the first actually around December 15th, you start to see strong inversions and will sometimes exceed ambient air quality standards. And that tends to last until mid-February. And I think Professor Whiteman's in the office, in the audience, and he published a nice study last year, and he determined that one of the worst times to live in Salt Lake is the last week in December and the first week in January. That's the most likely time to have an inversion. So if you wish to plan your vacation, that might be when you want to do it. So, so we suffer from these periodic high levels of pollution. And in 2013, we exceeded national ambient air quality standards on 35 days, and that went down to 13 days in 2014. They don't yet have the data for 2015, but you can see that year to year there are big variations based on our meteorology as to how many days we will exceed ambient air quality standards. Also, to put this into context, a bad day for air quality in Salt Lake City is very much like an average day in Beijing. So Beijing's annual PM2.5 level is 75 micrograms per cubic meter, thereabouts. And that's a pretty bad day in Salt Lake County. So this trend graph was from last week, and this is basically showing the part of the graph behind it where you're on the upswing. So you can see some diurnal variations in PM 2.5 levels, but you also see that trend of increasing levels. And that's typically what we see until we get some nice weather to move that particulate matter out. So where does it come from? So we've got emissions from our point sources, our stacks, things like the refineries and Kennecott. We also have all of our vehicles, anything with wheels. We have backhoes and snow blowers. We also have our home heating, auto body paint shops. So the emissions from all these processes come into our atmosphere that's capped by this lid, and they react. And they react and form fine particulate matter. So what happens when we look at a filter that we've collected during an inversion, we'll see about a third of the material on that filter is what's called direct particulate matter. So that comes from its source as a particle. So that's like soot from a diesel engine or particles from brake wear. The other 2/3 come from reactions in the atmosphere. So those are reactions of NOx emissions, nitrous oxide emissions, volatile organic compounds, sulfur dioxides, and ammonia, and those react to form fine particulate matter. And it's important to mention that we're responsible for most of the direct and indirect particulate particulate levels. So sometimes I hear someone say, oh, a lot of our problem is indirect, so there's nothing we can do about it. That's not true. We're responsible for the majority of the VOC and the NOx emissions and the sulfur dioxide emissions from our industrial, our consumer, and our combustion sources. But so as you start thinking about ways to control particulate matter, it gets a little more complicated. Because as you remove a pound of direct particulate matter emissions, that's a pound less of burdens to our airshed. However, if you remove a pound of VOCs or NOx or sulfur dioxide, you get a less than a 1 pound reduction. So it just makes it a little bit harder as you think about control strategies. And then to further complicate matters, not all volatile organic compounds have the same reactivity. So you get different benefits by reducing different VOCs. So as we start to move towards health effects, one thing that's interesting is the composition of our particulate matter during inversions. So because a lot of this is from secondary, if you look at other cities in the US, and in particular if you focus on this red box nitrates, you can see that throughout on their annual average, usually less than a quarter of the particulate matter in other areas of the country are from nitrates. Whereas in Salt Lake City during our wintertime inversion, over half of what we see on a filter comes from ammonium nitrates. And so this makes our pollution a little different. There are some other areas that experience this, other mountain valleys that have similar compositions, but it also has health implications that are not well understood. So if we start to think about where do our sources come from and how does the state go about regulating us? So basically, they do an inventory. That's a big accounting method where they start from the ground up. They count our numbers of vehicles, how much fuel do we use, how many homes are there in the valley, and they come up with emission factors. They use sophisticated modeling for our vehicles. They get emissions directly from some of our large point sources, and then they use emission factors for how many auto body paint shops do we have, and what are our emissions like from dry cleaning. And some of the quality of this data is very high. like a continuous emission monitor from a point source. Some of the other data, like how many people are burning wood or what are really the emissions from paint shops, those are quite a bit more uncertain. So, but as we look at this in summary, if you take mobile sources, so I've lumped on-road and off-road, all those sources together. If you lump them together, they're responsible for about 57% of all the emissions. So that's PM 2.5 and the precursors. And those emissions are decreasing as cleaner vehicles work their way through our fleet. And that's as a result of federal standards. So area sources, those are responsible for about 27% of our emissions. Those are things like home heating, light industrial sources, and those are also decreasing, in part as a result of the rules that the state has passed to require different VOC contents in consumer products, to require additional regulations on auto body paint shops and home heating and all types of little sources. Our point sources, our stacks, those are 16%, and those are actually increasing. And I'm looking at a time window of about the next 4 or 5 years. Over the course of the next 20 to 30 years, things may change a little bit as population continues to grow. But it's also very interesting to think about where does the state say that our pollution comes from, and where do people think it comes from? So this graph compares the Utah Division of Air Quality, their most recent SIP in 2014, to a Utah Foundation report that looks at where people think pollution comes from. And there is one big discrepancy here, and that's point sources. So people tend to think that point sources are responsible for the majority of the pollution, and that area and mobile sources are less than what the state says. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is I think the point sources are a very visible source of pollution with their stacks and flares and so forth. Also, I think it's probably a lot easier to think that someone else should be changing their behavior rather than we should be changing our behavior. And then finally, I think there's some confusion about what is an area source and what's a point source. And then, so I'll just talk briefly about some work that we did at the University of Utah in partnership with the Division of Air Quality to sort of ground truth the Division of Air Quality's inventory. So you can use the fact that particles that come from a diesel engine look very different than particles that come from a wood-burning stove or a gasoline engine. So you can use that with some statistical tools to try to get an estimate of where the particles come from. So when we did that and we compared it to the state inventory, we in general saw that the results agreed, with one exception, and that was that wood smoke and cooking appeared to be quite a bit higher than the inventory originally suggested. So that sparked a very lively discussion, and it sparked some common sense measures to begin to address the problem, such as improved education, looking at people who use wood burning in this valley as their sole source of heating, and then trying to be more proactive about calling no burn days when you knew that an inversion was setting up. And then maybe some not so common sense method or suggestions, such as proposing an outright ban. And that led to a lot of public outrage and discussion, and we'll see where the whole wood burning discussion ends up. But the debate is still going, and the Division of Air Quality is working on 2 studies to try to get a better handle of this distribution between wood smoke and cooking, because the study we did wasn't able to resolve those 2. In addition, I have a little study going on with some students looking at the spatial distribution of wood burning. And I can tell you that on a winter's evening, it's not that hard in Salt Lake City to drive around and see wood burning from a residential chimney, and to see PM levels go up by 20, 30, or even double because of that, likely because of that source. And we're working on data that allow us to resolve the wood burning from just particulate matter in general. So I think there'll still be some work going on with regard to wood burning. But I think the big message here is that understanding the sources of pollution is really critical to making good decisions. But that is not the only problem, is making sure that you understand the sources. The other, and this is also key for health effects, is that communicating this is also very important. So this gives an example around the wood burning discussion. And this graph on the left was placed on the website of the Citizens for Responsible Wood Burning, who were campaigning against the wood burning ban. And their message was to highlight how much cleaner newer wood burning devices were compared to older wood burning devices. And they are right. The that newer wood-burning devices are much cleaner than fireplaces and older wood-burning devices. However, what they did was they cropped EPA's graph, and what they neglected to show you is how much cleaner natural gas is, which is the typical method of heating here in the valley. So I think that this kind of not showing people the complete picture probably contributed to some of the anger and the discussion. But they were not the only people to maybe not present a complete picture. Around the same time, some people received little flyers in their utility bill saying that wood burning was responsible for about 38% of emissions during an inversion day, and that wasn't quite true. They I think misinterpreted what the study we did said, and in reality we thought it was about 5% of the problem. So I think there was miscommunication on both sides that also contributed to the anger and the discussion. So just to emphasize that, I think that not only a good knowledge of the sources, but also good communication about that is key to addressing our problem. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob, who's going to talk more about the health effects.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Kerry and I get to do this a lot, and this is really a nice venue for us. It's nice to have people who are interested and committed to trying to make some changes here, who want to understand the problem better. So I'm going to now transition and tell you in a little more detail about the health effects. She talked about the global numbers. But how does this really come into play with individuals and the particular health problems we see? And there's a great deal of epidemiologic data from many sources linking air pollution to effects on human health. When you have worse air quality, you have higher total mortality and a shortened life expectancy. You have more mortality from cardiopulmonary disease, so from heart attacks, strokes, and sudden death. You have a higher instance of asthma, and you have more asthma attacks. And patients who have chronic bronchitis or emphysema, cigarette-related lung disease, have many worse symptoms when they're confronted with more air pollution. And recently it was announced that actually air pollution is a major cause of cancer. It's probably second leading behind cigarette smoke. Now, to do a little bit more biology here, this is a version of a picture that Kerry showed you a minute ago. When we look at, here's a human hair, and we have our particulate pollution, and the PM2.5 is really quite tiny. You can't see individual particles like that. We see what happens to the air overall out here when we bring all those particles together. And the lung is a remarkable organ. We don't realize how large our lungs are. And it shows up when you look at this branching diagram here that shows that air comes in through your windpipe and your lungs, the pipes then branch and branch and branch again. It goes through about 23 generations of branches. And that makes for an enormous surface area. And this graph on the right shows the airway generation as we get out to that 23 and what the cross-sectional area is. And as you get out into the smaller airways, we're talking about a cross-sectional area of about 500 centimeters squared. And that seems pretty big. But I'd like to move to this picture. This is a tennis court, and I sometimes quiz my medical students about this because if you actually took the gas exchange part of the lung, the part where air and blood come close together, and spread it out on one big surface, it would come out at about 100 square meters. The size of a single tennis court. So each day, as I walk around in our air here, I'm taking in about 10,000 liters of air, if I'm not exercising too hard, and I'm bringing that air out into this enormous surface of about 100 square meters and bringing those particles into very close proximity to my bloodstream. And this shows up here with a picture of what your lung looks like. Your lung's a very lacy, delicate organ, and there are actually blood vessels running through all these little walls, and this open area is just air. And this is where the particles go and hang out and come in very close proximity to your blood, and they also, all those particles stimulate the cells within your lung and cause lots of reactions there. So it took a while for people to start to understand how air pollution impacted health and how it changed mortality. There's a very famous study that was done out of Harvard called the 6 City Studies. They looked at these 6 cities, Steubenville, Harriman, Topeka, Watertown, St. Louis, and Portage. And they said, let's just see if there's a correlation between the quality of the air in those communities and mortality rates. And we'll control for smoking and obesity and water and all those other things and do some very high-level statistics, but let's see if there's a relationship just with the air quality. And they looked at fine particles, and I think as Kerry mentioned, the threshold that the EPA sets for saying our particulates too high, the classic number is 35 micrograms per cubic meter. So all of these have levels under the 35. But if we look at the rate ratio, the mortality rate, versus fine particles, you get a very nice line that says the higher the particles in the atmosphere, the higher the mortality rate. People die more often, they die earlier if they're living in an environment with higher particulates. And they found that this held when they broke it down over time during different periods. It held with when they tried to take out all of the other complicating factors. And it seemed to hold whether they wanted to look at a single window at a time or over a longer period of time. Now, adverse air quality, particularly particulate pollution, impacts lots of different organs. And I use this shadow homunculus to help me go through it. It causes increased strokes, and as I'll tell you in a minute, it can cause accelerated loss of memory and decline in mental function. In the lungs, it causes emphysema and chronic bronchitis. It worsens emphysema and chronic bronchitis. It both causes and worsens asthma. It leads to more severe episodes of pneumonia, more frequent episodes of pneumonia, and can contribute to lung cancer. And the organ that particularly is involved is it causes problems with the heart, increased numbers of heart attacks, arrhythmias, and episodes of sudden death. In particular, with heart disease, well, let me go back. So as Kerry introduced early on, if you look at a graph if you look at a map of the world and where air quality is poor, Salt Lake City doesn't really show up on it because our average air quality is fine. But we have these short periods of intense air pollution that are a problem. And trying to distinguish long-term effects from short-term effects is one of the big challenges in looking at air pollution. With respect to heart disease, we know that long-term, you get increased heart attacks. So large national cohort studies have demonstrated direct relationships between PM 2.5 locally and both total mortality and cardiovascular mortality. And to put numbers on this, the cardiovascular risk increases by about 10% for every 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM 2.5. So not a trivial number. What about short-term? There have been a couple nice studies that have come from Utah looking at rates of heart attacks during and after inversions here. And Arden Pope did a study that was published in 2006. Arden is an important air quality researcher who's based down at BYU and has done a bunch of work here. And they found that there was that even with these short periods of poor air quality, there was a 4% increase in the rate of heart attacks for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter increase in PM 2.5. And this has been validated in repeat studies. So we know not only living in poor air quality for long periods of time causes you more cardiovascular problems, but even short periods of time are important. Now, the people who are particularly vulnerable are those who already have heart disease. This isn't taking people without coronary artery disease and generating a heart attack. But if you already have coronary artery disease and you're exposed to these inversions, then your risk of having a heart attack then and there goes up. So we know that short-term exposure to particulate pollution can trigger these ischemic events with inadequate blood flow in the heart. It does the same thing in the brain with causing strokes. And if you just look at electrocardiograms, you see increased evidence of injury on those electrocardiograms. I want to jump down to this final point here, and that is we now know that all particles aren't the same. We don't know as much about that as we'd like to. We need to do a lot more work on the impact of the specific chemical composition of the particles. But there's some recent data that says that the cardiac effects from the secondary particles that are generated in the atmosphere are actually greater than from the primary particles. And this is important as we think about how we can alleviate this problem, because it means that you want to target decreasing the production of secondary particles. It also means we have particular problems here in Salt Lake, because if you look at our particulates during a non-inversion period, when the wind's blowing through and everything's fine, you have a higher proportion of primary particles then than when you put the lid on with a high pressure area and you allow that atmospheric chemistry to take place over time. So our inversions are really particularly problematic. I'm going to move from heart disease to lung disease, and I like talking about this study because it really is a relevant short-term study. And this is a study that was done in London, and they did a randomized crossover trial. They took some adults with mild to moderate asthma and had them take walks. And they took a walk either in Hyde Park, that's beautiful with low levels of pollution, or they had them take a walk along Oxford Street where there were diesel buses and cabs everywhere. And they assessed the pollution levels, they looked at changes in pulmonary function, and they looked at evidence of inflammation in the lungs. And to give you an idea of the pollution levels, here's our PM 2.5. Remember, 35 is the EPA standard. And on Oxford Street, it was the median level was 28, and in Hyde Park, it was about 12. So these are numbers that we see here all the time. And when they looked at pulmonary function, let me pull you down to this bottom graph. This is the amount of air somebody blows out in 1 second. And it's really our most commonly used indicator of how somebody's airways are doing. And when they had these people taking their 2-hour walk in Hyde Park, in the low particulate environment, they didn't really get a change. They just stayed at baseline. When they took their walk along Oxford Street, their pulmonary function declined. Okay, that's fine for 2 hours, but then they went away, they went home, and they followed them over a number of hours and then had them come back the next day. And the interesting thing is their pulmonary function stayed down not only through 7 hours, but even 22 hours later was still down. So we saw ongoing effects from that short exposure. And you also, when they looked at markers of airway inflammation, there was ongoing inflammation that lasted a day after this walk along the street. I mentioned cognitive function. There's a large study called the Nurses' Health Study. They enrolled a number of nurses early in their lives and basically followed them. They've used this study to look at impact of diet, look at cancer, but look at heart disease. But they also, in 19,000 women, did some very careful assessments of cognitive function as these women reached ages 70 to 81. And they correlated the results on some of those tests with where they'd lived and what the exposure to particulate air pollution had been over their lives. And they measured cognitive function in a very sophisticated test, and they found that there was a decline over time, and that people who were exposed to higher levels of particulate pollution had more rapid decline in cognitive function. And when you looked at it, for those in the highest quintile, they had, in effect, a 2-year acceleration in the cognitive decline that they would have with age. Now, this is this is average exposure over a long period of time, not episodic exposure as in our inversions, but it's really some very scary information. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up kids. One of my colleagues who's a pediatrician has a picture of a child in mining gear with coal dust all over the face, saying that the children are really the canary in the coal mine. And I think there's some truth to that. So we know that children are particularly vulnerable to air pollution. Kids who grow up in more polluted environments have a higher instance of asthma. They have worse consequences of the asthma with more exacerbations. We know that their lungs don't grow as large. There have been a number of nice studies showing that kids who grow up in areas where there are higher levels of particulate pollution, when they reach adulthood, their lungs are smaller. That surface area I talked about is lower. There's also suggestion that IQ points are lost when you grow up in a more polluted environment. And it's useful to think about it this way. This is, if you say IQ is a bell-shaped curve, and you take a median of 100, if you shift that curve to the right and the median now drops to 95, that's important. We've lost intelligence that's terribly precious. But it's particularly important when you look at the tails of the curve. So if we've got a mean IQ of about 100, that means in the state of Utah with 2.9 million in 2012, we've got 72,000 who will fall down a couple standard deviations below and be intellectually impaired. And we've got about 72,000 who will be 2 standard deviations above and be really quite intellectually gifted. If you shift the curve by just 5 points, what you've done is you've increased the number of intellectually impaired who will need help from the state, who may have more difficult lives, and you've cut down on the intellectually gifted group, so that subtle changes in air quality can have important long-term effects on our broader population. So how do particles that enter the lung do all this? And people often ask me this, so I thought I'd throw up this slide. The particles are inhaled, and 2.5 is a terribly important size. We have great defense mechanisms to get rid of coarse particles. You get stuff in your nose, it collects at branching points as the tubes go on, your mucus collects it, so that larger particles often are collected and never make it out into that delicate peripheral lung. 2.5 microns, though, is a perfect size to evade all those defenses. It's big enough to deposit in the lung and not be breathed out again, but is small enough to get on in there. So, as I often say, if I were going to develop a drug delivery system where someone would get a drug into their lungs by inhalation, I would target particles of about 2.5 micron. It's the perfect size for this. So those particles come in, the PM2.5 gets in and comes out into the lung. And several things happen. The lung is actually a very active organ and it responds to the local environment. So you will end up with the lung generating reactive oxygen species, generating inflammatory molecules, and those effects will get into the bloodstream and spread to the heart, to blood vessels throughout the body. You also have particles that appear to be able to actually translocate across the wall of the blood vessels in the lung, and all of these things get out and influence your vascular functions. So you end up with more high blood pressure. You end up with thicker blood that is more likely to clot. All those things contribute to decreased blood flow in the coronary arteries and more likely heart attacks. At the same time, there's some very poorly understood but clearly important autonomic changes that are basically reflexes that your body sets up to the irritation that comes into your lungs. So you don't have to get the particles distributed throughout the body, although that does contribute, but you get secondary signals from the lung that lead to the changes in neurologic function, the changes in heart function, changes in blood function. It's how breathing something in can affect your whole body. Okay, does it make any difference if we put in efforts to improve air quality? This is a terribly important question. Can we do anything about this? Go back to the 6 city studies. They looked at these same cities over time as air quality improved in the cities. And it's a terrible graph, but it actually communicates it pretty well. Steubenville, air quality improved from an average PM level of close to 30 down to the lower 20s. And their mortality ratio improved. Harriman improved. Each of these studies improved over time with improving air quality. So we changed mortality directly. there have been a number of large studies around the country with detailed monitoring information that have compared air quality in the late 70s and early 80s, and then again in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And they did cross-sectional comparisons within each period and also compared over time. And again, they controlled for smoking, access to health care, and all those sorts of things. And the interesting result is that air quality improved across the entire country over this time period. Life expectancy overall increased as well. It increased by about 2.7 years. And there was clearly a negative association between life expectancy and pollution levels. Pollution levels went down, life expectancy went up. And they found that a reduction of 10 micrograms per cubic meter resulted in an increase of 0.6 years of life. And this benefit held regardless of the baseline. It's very interesting. Even if you had relatively good air at baseline, if you improved it some, you did better still, and mortality improved. And their estimate overall was that between 1980 and 2000, simply improving air quality was responsible for about 15% of the change in life expectancy. We have some local information that is quite relevant and interesting. This is Geneva steel. And you may recall that there was a big strike at Geneva Steel down in Utah Valley. It was a long enough strike that the mill was closed, I believe, for 18 months, so that it went through a couple of seasons and they could really get a good pattern. Air quality improved dramatically during that time. Here these are PM10 concentrations. This was before we started using PM2.5. And as you can see, the levels of PM10 dropped while the mill was closed and then went back up when it opened again. And when they looked at children's respiratory hospital admissions, they found either for bronchitis and asthma or for pneumonia and pleurisy, they found that when the mill was open, we had lots of admissions. They were cut in half when the mill was closed. And then, by the way, the mill opened up again and they went back up. Pretty clear experiment showing the impact of local air pollution on children's health. That mill is now closed, by the way, for those of you who don't know that. As we talk about what we can do, we can certainly improve our overall air quality, but people ask me often, what else can I do personally to protect myself? And one of the questions that often comes up is, how effective are masks? So I will tell you, a surgical mask that is halfway off your face, as we often will see in pictures, is useless and not doing anything. There are high efficiency masks that will get rid of most of these particles. This is one that was tested in a study actually in Beijing, and they had some individuals who had heart disease basically do the same thing we saw in that London study. They had them go walk around either with the mask or without the mask, and they measured and they did electrocardiograms as they walked. And actually the number fits perfectly with what Kerry was telling you. The Beijing PM2.5 was 74 micrograms per cubic meter on these days. And they found that the mask was comfortable, people liked it. And they found a statistically significant decrease in the electrocardiogram evidence of changes. They found the blood pressure went down, and heart rate variability is something that, although it's not intuitive, increased heart rate variability is good. So they found increased heart rate variability with this. So patients who walked around with these masks on seemed to have less stress from the air pollution. They felt better and were able to do a lot. So I've now shifted my perspective and I say, yeah, the high efficiency masks may be a reasonable idea for susceptible individuals. What do we tell our patients about exercise? How should we help people understand how to live in our valley during these inversions? Exercise is terribly important, and we know that as a society, if anything, we get too little exercise and that there are terrible health effects of getting too little exercise. So we have to be careful how we send these messages here. This is a study looking at particles deposited in the lung. If you are either at rest or exercising in a high particle environment. Now, what happens is when you are at rest, you have a certain number of particles over time that deposit in your lungs, And that the fraction of particles, the fraction of what you breathe in and out, goes up if you're exercising. And that's fine, but if you really look at the dose response in terms of how many particles, because you're breathing a lot more, not only do you have a higher fraction, but you're breathing more. So the total particles that are deposited in the lung go up dramatically with exercise. So exercising in a polluted environment, you're going to get a lot more of those particles into your lungs compared to if you were simply doing your normal activity. And the same thing, this is something I tell young, fit athletes when they're talking about the consequences of exercising in pollution. This looks at the work these individuals could do. These were elite cyclists who were riding a stationary bike either in a low particulate environment or in a high particulate environment, and they looked at how much exercise they could do. And the answer is, when you're exercising in a high particle environment, you can do less. The difference is about 5%. And we say, well, that's not much. And then I tell these athletes, if you look back, say, to the 2002 Olympics here, and you look at the cross-country skiing competition, the difference between the gold medal winner and the last place finisher was less than that. So it makes a big difference. And we talk about our valley as all one common space in terms of pollution. But it's important to remember that it's really not, and that roadways are terribly important. A great deal of our pollution comes from roadways. This is looking at particles. This is PM1, so very small particles, and the distance from a highway. And as you can see, the further you are from the highway, the lower your particle exposure. So as people are exercising, I tell them, stay away from the roads and you'll be better off. So the cyclists who are riding up and down 700 East are probably not in the best location and would be better off being off and away from these major roadways. Okay, so what do I tell my patients overall? First of all, I tell them it's very important to pay attention to air quality. We need to all be more knowledgeable about this. I want them also to think about air quality and their symptoms. I want them to pay attention to whether they get worse symptoms when the air is bad or does it not impact them. When air quality is poor, it's particularly important for them to use their medications carefully. That's not the time to just skip a bunch of things. And during our bad air days, I tell people they should be exercise. I like people to exercise, but I tell them they should exercise away from roadways. I think it's a good time to think about exercising indoors and doing some cross-training. We know indoor air and outdoor air have a very complex relationship, but in general, indoor air is better during our inversions than it is outdoors. So I tell people with heart disease and lung disease, this is a time to stay indoors. And I'm going to start thinking about masks for high-risk individuals who want to do a lot of outdoor activity during the inversions. So it seems like we know a great deal about air pollution. We know a great deal about health effects. Why do we need to study more of this? Why isn't it all just clear and we're done? Well, in many ways, we've just scratched the surface of the biological effects. I talked to you about how particles get into the lung and then have effects around the body, but we really don't understand many of those details, and we need to know more about the mechanisms. Because if we know the mechanisms, we'll be able to come up with better ways to intervene and alleviate the problems. We have very limited understanding about temporal relationships. Is it all about cumulative effects versus acute exposures versus repeated acute exposures? And we need more detail to have people understand the risk from these episodic exposures. And we need better understanding of the effects on specific diseases rather than just the broad mortality and cardiac problems. One very important thing we don't understand is gene-environment interactions. We don't understand why groups of individuals are exposed to the same pollution, and some of them will have health problems and others won't, even though they seem to have the same baseline risks. And obviously, we want to know what can be done to alleviate or interrupt these processes beyond simply limiting the exposure. On the engineering side, we have much more we want to learn as well. What are the contributions of the specific components of air pollution? What are the key synergies of these components? Are the health effects largely related simply to the size, or does the chemical composition make a difference? Kerry talked about how our PM 2.5 is a little different from the rest of the country with more ammonium nitrate. And we need to understand the consequences of that, because if we know that, we can then intervene in different ways. The atmospheric chemistry is incredibly complicated and is an area where we need to learn more so we can deal with those secondary particles. If we can find the rate-limiting steps, can we decrease the key particles by strategic interventions as opposed to just global changes? We need to know more about the the geospatial relationships, and a particularly important area is involved with economic and behavioral aspects of the burden of air pollution. We know that air pollution, the burden of air pollution, is not distributed evenly across the society. People in lower socioeconomic conditions bear an increased burden, and as we start to talk about regulations and ways to change things, it's often more expensive for them on a relative basis. We also know everybody talks a great deal about the cost of improving air, the regulatory costs, the costs in terms of personal freedom. It's very little or too little conversation about the indirect costs. How much more do we all pay for insurance because of the consequences of air pollution for health? Is our workforce degraded? Is the quality of life here degraded? Businesses that aren't coming to Salt Lake City or to Utah. These economic points we really don't understand well enough, and we're trying to do much better modeling of that now. Cost-benefit analysis of the Clean Air Act. This is an estimate that the EPA came up with as part of their 40th anniversary celebration. And they said, thanks to the changes in 1990, by the year 2020, you would have this many events averted that year. So adult mortality would go down, mortality due to particulates, due to ozone, fewer heart attacks, fewer asthma exacerbations. But look down here, the days lost from school and the days lost from work. It's an enormous change. And the EPA's estimate was that, yes, improving the things they stipulated as part of the 1990 update of the Clean Air Act cost a lot of money, about $65 billion. They estimated the benefits at $2 trillion. It's an enormous benefit. So we have a program for air quality, health, and society that Kerry and I run. It's a multidisciplinary program involving health sciences, engineering, atmospheric sciences, economics, public policy, law. And we're trying to come together to address some of these problems because we think the university here is ideally situated to really address these problems in a meaningful way. We've got some things that the university has going on at the moment that are important. We have the electric vehicle program. We have increased measurements in cooperation with DAQ, both to better understand PM 2.5 around the valley, to understand air toxics, and we need much better resolution with small monitors that can really define what's going on throughout the valley. There's also a large grant that was just awarded called a PRISM study in bioinformatics that the NIH has supported. That's a very large grant to better integrate clinical data and local exposure data. And this is a very exciting prospect for us. And what can we all do? On the near term, travel smart, cleaner fuels, Tier 3 fuels that you may have heard about will be a great improvement. It's nice that Tesoro is now committed to producing Tier 3 fuel, and that will be of great benefit for our emissions. I think we need to address wood burning. We're not done with that at all. It's still a major contributor, and we need to have a better strategy for that. And in the longer term, obviously, we need enhanced mass transit. Building codes are terribly important. Changes we make now will impact things 20 years from now, and it's much cheaper to do it now than later, and move towards zero emission vehicles. So with that, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, and we'd be happy to answer any questions if you have time.
Are no burn days
So the question is whether no burn days are enforced. It's interesting, the problem DAQ has with all this is DAQ is underfunded for all its monitoring, but is horribly underfunded for enforcement. So the number of people they have around who can go check, 5 people.
So to add to that, they have 5 enforcement people for the entire state, for all their point sources, for everything going out in the Uinta Basin, for wood burning, for everything. But I should mention that the health department has agreed to help with the wood burning enforcement. So they're working together to help the Division of Air Quality.
And there is a call-in line. You know, if you notice a problem and want to call in, you can do that. The problem is also the penalties for burning on no burn days are first time a warning, then a small fine. I mean, it's not a very strict penalty at all.
So the answer is no.
Yes.
Thank you, first of all, for an excellent presentation. And this is the latest in a series of scholarly presentations presented. Also heard presentations by our. My question has to do with civic. What do we as citizens do to all the good information that we have when it seems like the state is dragging its feet in sustainable and viable solutions? And I'm focusing right now on the Clean Power Plan, which seems to me to be for addressing air quality and looking at states in compliance. But we've had some recent developments. A week ago today, the Supreme Court on hold the CPP, thanks in part to a lawsuit filed by and 2 days later, the Utah Department of Air Quality suspended its basically said that nothing happens until further notice. I don't know if they got a call from the AG's office and said back off, but it doesn't seem to me that the DAQ, quality board on which you both serve, anything now without some heat from the Attorney General. So if the state won't take what then do we do? Who would take it? And that's why I turn to scholars, the people who've got the details, who know what the problem is, here at the U, here at the BYU. And I'm wondering if your colleagues who get it thought of combining forces to basically take the lead on this.
I'll start.
Okay.
I'll start, and Kerry will have more to say. Couple of things. The power plants are really an interesting issue for us because although they are tremendous emitters and they have a major role in CO2 emissions and climate change, they actually don't emit into our airshed. So that if we made all of the coal-fired power plants go away, we wouldn't change what we have out here. So just, you agree with that? Yeah, so we have to be careful about mixing those conversations. My understanding from DAQ is that they've suspended things because they really don't know where it will go, because they don't know what the rule is going to be when it's done. I think there should be more pressure. I will tell you, I moved here in 2007 and have watched how things change. As you talk to legislators here, it's clear that they, for the first time, are hearing the constituents far more than before, and the constituents are talking about this. So the most important thing I see is loud, strident, continuous comments from constituents to our legislators in the state to let them know that this is intolerable and that we need to be doing everything we can to change this. So that's my first point.
And I guess just to add to that, one challenge that thank you. one challenge that we have, or the legislators have with regard to air quality, and even relevant to the Clean Power Plan, is that people call their legislators about air quality when we have an inversion. So typically if you talk to a legislator, their phone is ringing off the hook during the inversion. The minute it stops, they don't hear anything more. And our legislative session ends in mid-March. And so by the time mid-March happens, we're no longer typically experiencing any inversions, and they're not getting any phone calls. So this is sort of off of their radar screen. So the one thing I would encourage citizens to do is, if they're concerned about this, to keep the pressure up continuously. The other thing is to get involved early. Legislators are looking for opportunities to write bills, and they're looking for those opportunities over the summer and early fall. And again, if you're waiting till January 15th to make your phone call to the legislator, it's probably a little late to have much of an impact.
So that's a partial answer to your question, and clearly more data is terribly important. And we work with BYU. We're trying to pull together. We work with USU and trying to pull all this together. We need more data, and I think the economic analysis is terribly important, because I think legislators, I hope, will respond to information about the true costs of all these things.
There was a study done in 2010 by Synapse Energy Economics, and they concluded that there were several hundred premature deaths every year. This is 2010. This was initially commissioned by the DAQ, but they didn't like the results, so they walked away from it, and it got shelved. And one of the points that was raised, as much as $1 billion in healthcare costs with the data that they had generated at that time. One of the things, of course, that they mentioned was that over 80% of the premature deaths occurred in Colorado or other downwind states, because the Hunter and Huntington and the other coal-fired power plants weren't polluting the Wasatch Front. We were exporting our poison to these new downwinders living in Colorado and other downwind states. And so far as I know, that the state has never done a follow-up on that study, that 2010 study that was specifically done for Utah.
Thank you. You know, a couple points come to mind for me. First of all, our legislatures have a hard time listening to us. Very seldom do they, you know, you can talk till you're blue in the face, and they don't seem to do what the people want. But, you know, I noticed you mentioned coal-fired power plants, but there's a lot of coal being burned in Salt Lake Valley too. And I guess you're mentioning it in with the wood as a solid fuel, but coal burned in a house is just as bad as anywhere else. And there are a lot of houses downtown that are still using coal, because that was the fuel of choice in those days.
And just to add to that, one of the challenges is that coal burns a little differently than wood, and some of these people that are burning coal are not burning it in a coal burning device. They'll burn it in a wood stove, and because coal burns hotter, it tends to it tends to cause cracks in the stove, which is now you've got a lot of exposure indoors, so that is a challenge.
And you don't get as much visual pollution from coal, because it does burn so much hotter, it consumes itself. But it also destroys the stove, like you say. If you buy a wood-burning stove, it says on it 100 times, don't burn coal. But, you know, I wish our legislators would listen to us, but they don't.
I'm sympathetic, and I get, this is a case where I just say we have to keep trying and, you know, just constantly grow the portion of the population that is speaking to them, because this is we have many places we can apply pressure, but this is an essential. That's an essential one.
That's a perfect segue into my comment. Today at 2 o'clock, they're having a hearing up at the Capitol for HB 316, which they're trying to. Somebody's put in a new building code law that would forbid any of the air quality committees from making any changes or recommendations to new building codes for new constructions. And so when you say nobody's listening to us, the reason is that people are not aware that these building codes and these rules and regulations are getting talked about up at the Capitol, and until you know about it, until you make yourself known and voice your opinions about, no, we want the air quality standards and new building codes to be enforced. We want to be able to, follow in and try to beat the curve on new building codes rather than going back to the 2012 standards. That's where we all can do our little part. So it turned out I was at the last week at the Thursday hearing, and it was probably one of the worst days we had for an inversion. And they made an amendment to it so that they would kind of not have to hold that hearing in one of the worst inversion days. And I just found out yesterday that hearing is now up for another vote at 2 o'clock today at the Capitol. So if anybody is interested, you can, it's up for public comment. If anybody wants to talk and just say, yeah, we vote no, we support that, just that's kind of my comment.
Thanks for mentioning that. And there are some local organizations such as Breathe Utah and Heal Utah that do a nice job following all the legislation that's related to air quality, and that it gives people an opportunity to at least know when what bills are coming up and what things might be beneficial for air quality to support and what things might be beneficial to complain about.
Am I next? Okay. So just in case people are interested in doing some political, participating in some political action, currently EPA is accepting public comments on a new Utah Regional Haze State Implementation Plan. This is in reference to EPA's public comment hearing that was held at the Salt Lake Library a few weeks ago. I think it was January 26th. But before they approve or disapprove the state implementation plan, they like to hear comments from the public. And so if you're interested in promoting clean air in Utah, I suggest going on regulations.gov and looking up this docket and submitting a well-written comment.
Mike. Sorry.
Sorry, he had the mic.
I'll give it to you. I'm curious about what happens to the air once it's polluted. Is it all just washed out of our valley when in the favorable conditions? Is it washed out and goes downstream, or does it eventually settle out?
There are a couple things that happens. First of all, it gets blown out of the valley, and then some of it precipitates out, and some of it just gets diluted and passed on to the downwind states.
So we might, in long term, we might expect to see that the world exposure increase?
So we already have some of that. So we do have some effects we see even from China. Certainly ozone comes, there's a lot of transport of ozone. So we have our local arrangement where, yes, we're rimmed with mountains and the lid sits on and we produce everything here, but we also are seeing effects worldwide, and that's going to only increase.
I got one now. So I was just wondering if you guys ever done any studies to determine if, like at certain high elevations where houses exist, not like top of the mountain, but like maybe high part of Bountiful or something, where you're kind of out of the inversion, where it gets a little bit better?
Yeah, so we cooperated with Professor Whiteman and some other folks in atmospheric science, and some people in chemical engineering got together on a student project, and we looked at levels of pollution. We actually used the avenues, sort of a transect up the avenues and various elevations. And basically you could see that if you live at the higher elevation, you get in the inversion later, you come out of it earlier. But there are the inversion isn't a perfectly stable mass. It does slosh around a little bit, and the mixing height varies throughout the day. So in general, your exposure is lower if you live up higher. But one of the challenges is sometimes I get called from people who want to move to Utah and they want to live in Park City because of air quality. And the only challenge is the more people that live out of the valley and drive to the valley, since mobile sources are responsible for such a big portion of our pollution, that's kind of a challenge if everyone wants to live up there and drive here.
And we don't monitor up there anyway.
Well, actually, the health department now has one.
They now have one?
But I checked yesterday and it wasn't working, so.
Yeah.
I worked for the State Office of Education, the Board of Education, for 27 years. Very rarely do the people who know about education have a chance to go before our legislature? When was the last time that you and your colleagues, and those of you that have the knowledge, when was the last time you were before our state legislators?
Well, I'll say that I've never had the opportunity to do it. I don't know if you have, but the Division of Air Quality is in front of them all the time. They're in front of the legislature on a weekly basis during the session.
And there are a number of advocacy groups, particularly, again, Breathe, Heal, Physicians for a Healthy Environment, that are very active there. I think that there's good information that shows up there. It's interesting, the Division of Air Quality is an interesting group. People sometimes blame them for a lot of this. They are working under challenging constraints. You know, we have this interesting law in the state that forbids DAQ from setting standards that are more stringent than the EPA. So we have to meet EPA standards, but we dare not be any more strict than that. And it's basically a law that Utah has that says we can't be California. You know, we can't go off and do something more that we need. And one of the pushes in the legislature in the last couple sessions has been to actually reverse that law. It has not made it through yet. I haven't seen whether it's on this year again.
I haven't yet either.
But having, you know, the ability to have local solutions that are separate from the national standards has a great deal of appeal, and I would think would have appeal to those who feel that Utah ought to be able to go its own way as well.
Never stop California.
No. Right. Did?
Yes. You have to make.
Yeah. Oh, the making a finding, though, is that is a poison pill.
No, you should. We'll talk about it later. But
Okay.
It did pass last year. That language was changed. There are people looking at.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate that.
So just a quick question. So you said that the pollution from mobile sources has actually been decreasing and the pollution from point sources has been increasing. So does that do anything to affect the trend? I noticed I don't think I caught any data on just the overall trends over the last 20 years.
That's a good point. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. So the overall pie is getting smaller. So as you inventory total emissions, that pie has been getting smaller. So as we crank down on various sources, but then the makeup of the pie starts to change.
There's also on that DAQ, and lots of people like to talk about the fact that the levels of pollution overall have been decreasing. But our population's growing like mad, so that if we talk about the susceptible individuals, those with diseases that make them prone to have problems with air pollution, the number of susceptible individuals is also going up steadily, so that we may have lower levels of our worst pollution, but the health effects, it's not clear that those are decreasing. They may actually be increasing.
So to compare to like 10 years ago?
I think remember, the inversions are a matter of the meteorology and the topography. So we have inversions are not determined by us. It's what's trapped in the inversion. And the levels of pollution in the inversions, they claim, has decreased over the last 10 years.
So that's a difficult question to answer. And I believe from Professor Whiteman's study that has slowly declined, but it's a very difficult trend to see because we're so confounded by the meteorology. So we may have, like last year was relatively warm and wet, and so we had very few inversion days. But then you may get another year like the year we had where we have 35 inversion days when we exceed national ambient air quality standards. So it's difficult to see a trend when year to year you see such huge variations. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
One more. I'm afraid I'm going to have to take off for another obligation here momentarily, but.
Is credible or survivable air achievable on inversion days?
So if you're not on Let me be sure I understand. So are you saying when we have inversions, could we reduce our air pollution to acceptable levels? And I think that we can. I think the first step is to do what you're talking about in terms of fewer days that are above threshold. Over time, one would hope with improved communities, decreased mobile source emissions, holding the line on the point sources and improving building codes, as we turn over the motor vehicle fleet, I think there is a reasonable chance we'll be able to get below that standard. But it's going to take a lot of work from everybody to do it. And again, the EPA has been our friend. Improving vehicle standards has been the single biggest effect we've seen. I think that's a fair statement. And we need to recognize that the steps the EPA has put in have been hugely helpful. We just need to keep pushing further. I'm sorry, these are great questions. I unfortunately have to be someplace else. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. Oh, thanks.